this event is sponsored, as with all of our other virtual events, is sponsored by the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation. And of course, the foundation gets its support in the memory of Pat Finley. So thank you to the Finley family and to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in all of our virtual programming. Today, our author is Dr. Alexander Bielakowski. He's assistant professor of history at the University of Houston downtown, as well as a former U.S. Army Reserve officer who has published on such diverse topics as the final years of the U.S. Horse Cavalry in the 1920s and 30s, African Americans in World War II, and Dwight D. Eisenhower as the first commander of NATO. He spent more than a decade educating military officers at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And currently he's the editor-in-chief of the peer-reviewed Journal of the U.S. Military History Review. He joins us today to talk about his newest work, Proud Warriors, African American Combat Units in World War II. Dr. Bielakowski, welcome.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you for having me.
No problem. I'm going to go ahead and turn the platform over to you. Nobody wants to hear me speak. They're all here to hear about your book. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and turn the platform over to you, Dr. Bielakowski, and we look forward to hearing about your newest work.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And hello, everyone who's listening. So as Eric pointed out, the title of my book is Proud Warriors, African American Combat Units in World War II. And my reason for writing this book is that I encountered quite a few books dealing with African American service, especially in World War II, that didn't make much of actual combat. And I found that kind of troubling, that the kind of sine qua non of being in the military, i.e. being in combat, was rarely being discussed. And so I decided, let's take a look at what's out there, and eventually came around to saying, hey, we need a book that just talks about that issue. So having said that, let me get started. I've structured my presentation basically the way my book itself is structured, so that the way the chapters kind of flow. It's important to, even though we're talking about World War II, that African Americans have contributed in combat to pretty much every war in American history, from the American Revolution on downward. And so I, go through and discuss very briefly some of that in the first chapter of my book. But moving into our era, this is a segregated military that we're dealing with. This is a military that there is one standard for African Americans. There's another standard for everybody else. Coming out of World War I, World War I had been very heavily supported by the African American community in the United States. And the belief was that by showing how patriotic they were, by showing how much they were willing to sacrifice in World War I, they would get the fullness of citizenship after the war. And they were very disappointed in that never happened. In fact, there were some pretty severe race riots in the immediate aftermath of World War I. And so for most African Americans, they feel cheated. They had served in World War I in very large numbers. Approximately 400,000 African Americans served in the United States Army in World War I. But there is no payoff to that. They don't get anything from that, in essence. And so going into World War II, the belief is it's going to be more of the same. And it's also important to understand that the majority of those who do serve in World War I serve in a support role. They do not serve in combat. And so again, this is another one of those things where you're not allowing us to bear our portion of the burden and then giving us credit for that. And so going into World War II, what most people think is going to happen is that African Americans are going to wind up being things like, here's some truck drivers or some kind of support role. And unfortunately, that is largely true. The majority of African Americans who serve in World War II, once again, are forced to serve in support roles. Fortunately, that had happened in World War I. It happens again in World War II. Public opinion, American public opinion starts to harden going into World War II in the late 1930s. Because of the negative feelings about how World War I went, both how African Americans served in World War I and how they were treated after World War I, there is a lot of talk about, in the African American press, about maybe we sit this one out, maybe we don't participate. So there's talk in the African American community as it's clear World War II, we are going to become involved in World War II very soon. The feeling is increasingly, hey, you know what? Maybe we're not going to participate. If they don't want us, they don't have us. And so that becomes a real crisis for the Roosevelt administration. If 10% of the American populace decides they don't want to participate in this coming world war, what is that going to do? I mean, besides the obvious social unrest, what would that do as far as manufacturing? What would that do as far as the military, et cetera, et cetera? And again, the African American press was very strong. And for those of us who live in the era afterward, we don't realize there were separate newspapers specifically directed toward African Americans. One or two of them are still around, the Chicago Defender. I'm a native Chicagoan, so I know about the Chicago Defender. But they had a lot of in the African American community at the time. And the image you see, in fact, in front of you, the man on the left, is a guy named Roy Ottley. And Roy Ottley was arguably the most prominent African American reporter to report on World War II. So again, there's this feeling that if the African American community sits out this war, that's going to be bad for all of us. So we have to do something about this. And so President Roosevelt begins to make efforts to fix this situation. And one of the first things he does is he creates the first African-American general officer in history, Benjamin O. Davis Sr., and there's General Davis himself. General Davis is a fascinating case study. He is a man who served during the Spanish-American War, initially as an enlisted man, gets a commission afterward through a competitive exam. The Army expanded after the Spanish-American War, and there weren't enough West Point graduates to fill the ranks. So there were competitive for all officers, so, white or African-American. He takes a competitive exam. He's given a commission, and he manages to serve continuously from the time of the Spanish-American War until World War II. So for over 40 years, he has been on active duty, and he is nearing retirement, mandatory retirement, being 42 years of service. And he's nearing retirement at the point where President Roosevelt gives him his star. He becomes a brigade commander in the 2nd Cavalry Division. He commands a brigade in the 2nd Cavalry Division. And which, by the way, I should point out, both of the regiments in that brigade are African-American, the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments. But for an awful lot of African-Americans, this is still seen as being a token thing. Okay, you found this one guy who you could theoretically make a general. You made him a general. He serves like 6 months or so as a brigade commander, and then he's going to go into retirement. Now, as it turns out, when mandatory retirement is reached, he's recalled to active duty and becomes a special assistant to the Secretary of the Army regarding African-American issues. So he'll actually remain on active duty until 1948, I believe. So he is one of the longest serving officers in the history of the United States Army, because he had roughly 50 years of active duty time all told before he finally retires, again, as a brigadier general. But again, for a lot of African Americans, again, this is a token, this isn't enough. What are you really doing? And so that tension is always there throughout World War II. The president arguably would have liked to have done more. He signs an executive order that prohibits discrimination in hiring for companies that are working for the federal government. So that does go a long way. A lot more African Americans are able to get jobs in factories and so forth during World War II. But when it comes to the armed forces, he is reluctant to push too far. He is reluctant to do something like desegregation because he believes that he's in a precarious situation. The President Roosevelt does. Because a good chunk of his party is, roughly half of his party is white Southerners. So the Democratic Party in those days was split roughly north and south. And north, it tended to be ethnic urbanites. By ethnic, I mean in those contexts, Italians, Poles, ethnic groups like that. And then the South, it's white Southerners. These two groups really had very little in common. And so he is always trying to balance the two groups to maintain his power base in Congress. So let's go into the actual, the combat branches and how all of this will work out in World War II. Now, of course, infantry is seen as being the premier combat branch of the United States Armed Forces, of the United States Army in particular. And in World War I, the Army fields 2 divisions to fight in France that are African American, and it does so likewise in World War II. So we have the 92nd Infantry Division, which fields 3 infantry regiments, and the 93rd Infantry Division, which likewise fields 3 regiments. World War I, it was 4 regiments to a division. World War II, it's 3 regiments to a division. That's a big, kind of organizational change that's made, which we won't get into. It's really not the purpose of what we're talking about. Second division will fight in Italy. For about roughly a year, they'll see combat in Italy. And the 92nd will have quite a few problems during their Italian service. And almost all of their problems can go back to one person, and that is Major General Edward Almond, who's known as Ned Almond, their division commander. And this is a picture of General Almond later on. He's on the cover of Time magazine during the Korean War. Still a major general, I'll point out, 10 years later. So that says a little something. Ned Almond is a Southerner. He is a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. He is an officer who is seen in the pre-World War II period as being a great staff officer. It is important to understand that in that period of time, were much more prized, I would argue, than in the modern Army. General Eisenhower, for instance, was seen as being a brilliant staff officer. The Army was much more tolerant in that period in history of saying you could be a good staff officer. That didn't mean you had to be a good commander. We still need good staff officers. President, then General Eisenhower, is a good example of that. He has almost no command experience before he is commanding the entire army in Europe. So the Army really looked much more highly on staff officers in that period of time. And so because Almond had been a really good staff officer, well, maybe he'll be a good field commander as well. He will prove both by his command of the 92nd Infantry Division in World War II and by his command of 10th Corps in Korea that he's not a very good field commander. He might have been a great staff officer, but he's not a good field commander. Not only is he not a very good commander, as a Southerner, carries with inherent prejudices against African Americans. And this is another important thing I have to note, is that the Army's attitude during this era was that only Southerners should command African American units. Why, you might ask? Well, the argument that the U.S. Army had at that time is that Southerners knew how to, and I'm going to do air quotes here, handle African Americans. That a Northerner would have no idea how to deal with African Americans because the northern population of African Americans was so much smaller in that era that they couldn't possibly relate to or understand or deal with African Americans. And of course, from our perspective, okay, so what you've done is you've just put people who have inherent prejudices against African Americans in charge of African Americans. How do you think that's going to go? And so not only is Almond a Southerner, almost every white officer in the 92nd Infantry Division is a Southerner who chosen because he knows how to, quote unquote, handle African Americans. So as you can see, the relationship between the officers and the soldiers in the 92nd Infantry Division, and likewise in the 93rd, is going to be pretty bad for that reason. Now, there is a good smattering of company grade African American officers, lieutenants and some captains, but above the rank of captain, African Americans are exceptionally rare, both in the 92nd Division and everywhere else in the Army. The numbers are very small above the rank of captain. Almond basically blames anything that goes wrong. Anything that goes wrong in the division is always the fault of the soldiers. It's never the fault of poor planning. It's never the fault of the division staff. It's never his fault. It's never the fault of the Germans. It's always the fault of the African American soldiers. And obviously, that's problematic. If you're not willing to say, hey, the enemy did a really good job, or any of these sorts of instances. And there's a couple instances when there are failed attacks on the part of the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy, where the opposing German commander will write that, you know, this thing went well for us because the Americans had put their troops in the wrong place, or other things like that. So the German commander that they're opposing in Italy, because it's the same commander for a good chunk of the time they're in Italy, that commander is actually more complimentary toward the men of the 92nd Division than their own division commander is. And just to let Ned Almond kind of tell you what he really thinks, I have this small quote, which I won't read, but you can read for yourself. That pretty much sums up his attitude toward his troops. And again, that attitude is generally shared by almost all of the white officers of the division. There are exceptions, but not many. In fact, Ned Almond's wife is actually at one point accused, when they're still stateside and they're still in training, his wife is accused of calling one of the telephone operators, there were female African-American telephone operators, is accusing her the N-word because she couldn't make the connection. In those days, it was very hard to make long-distance calls. You had to go through a number of years to eventually get a long-distance call to go. And this operator could not get the call to go through because of the circumstances. And supposedly Ned Almond's wife referred to her with that epithet. And, I mean, if his wife is even using the term, you know, how do you think he's going to have an attitude about it? So, again, 92nd Division does not have a good reputation after the war. But again, in my research, I really think it has more to do with poor leadership from Almond on down. And poor working relationships. I mean, that's one of the fundamental issues. If you have to work with somebody day in, day out, but you have a poor relationship with them, how's the unit going to perform? modern day, we would call it the toxic leadership. I think that would be appropriate. Now, there's another division also fielded in World War II, and that's the 93rd Infantry Division. They're sent to the Pacific because the feeling is that they don't want any more African-American divisions in Europe. So these guys are sent to the South Pacific, and basically they're just made garrison troops on islands that we've already captured. And what happens is, it is only because a U.S. Congressman, Hamilton Fish from New York. Now, Hamilton Fish, that family is an old New York family, old, very wealthy, very prominent New York family. And Hamilton Fish's uncle, in fact, had died during the charge up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War while serving with Teddy Roosevelt. Well, Fish himself joins the New York National Guard prior to World War I and serves in combat with African-American troops in France in World War I. And so he is very positively predisposed to African-Americans, and he supports them. And so when Fish finds out that they've assigned the 93rd Division to the Pacific just to garrison islands where there's nothing happening, he raises a ruckus in Congress and gives some speeches that get into the congressional record and so forth. And in desperation, the Secretary of War basically tells the Army, you've got to send at least a battalion or so of the 93rd Division into combat. So for about 3 months, 1 battalion plus some support troops are sent into combat. They see legitimate combat. By the time they are withdrawn, the local commander, who did not want them at all, grudgingly argues that, you know what, I didn't have high hopes for these guys, and they were green when they came, obviously, but over time they've gotten better. And he basically admits that if they had stayed and continued to fight, they would be just as good as any of the other units attached to my command. But that's it. It's basically a battalion plus some support units, and that's it. The rest of the 93rd Division just occupies islands that we've already captured in the Pacific and really contribute, quite frankly, nothing to the war itself. And again, if it wasn't for Congressman Hamilton Fish raising a ruckus because he had experience with African-American troops in World War I, they would never even done that. So what are some other infantry units? There are some other non-divisional infantry units that are raised during World War II. And the 24th is one of the oldest infantry, African-American infantry units in the Army, originally raised right after the Civil War. They never see combat. In fact, the only one of these units that I'm showing you here, these kind of extra units that sees combat, is the 366th Infantry Regiment. And the 366th is really interesting because the 366th is formed around a bunch of African-American officers who had been in the Organized Reserve Corps. So in the 1920s and 30s, the Army Reserve as we know it, and which I even served in, does not exist. We have something called the Organized Reserve Corps. And there are units that exist on paper in the Organized Reserve Corps, but very seldom are they actually organized more than on paper. They kind of exist on paper so that guys who had graduated from college ROTC and have been commissioned second lieutenants have somewhere to go. Basically, that's how it works. So the 366th, when we are gearing up for World War II, the 366th is a whole bunch of African-American Organized Reserve Corps officers who've all been thrown onto this one unit on paper. And then once the war actually kicks off, they draft a bunch of African-American enlisted men, throw them in. And so you have the largest organization in the entire United States Army that is commanded from colonel all the way down. Everybody is African-American. So the 366th Infantry Regiment is entirely African-American, from the colonel who commands the regiment, West Hamilton, down all the way to the lowest private. Every single man is African American. The 366th is sent to North Africa. They guard air bases in North Africa, then they're sent to Italy. Likewise, are guarding air bases in Italy. When the 92nd Infantry Division goes into combat and starts taking losses, in order to beef up the division, the local area commander says, well, we've got this other African-American infantry regiment, the 366th, we'll just give it to you. Ned Almond doesn't want them. And the reason Ned Almond doesn't want the 366th is because from the colonel on down, they're all African-American and inherently distrusts African-Americans. But he has to take them. They attach him to their division. The commander, the colonel who's commanding the regiment, submits a formal request that they get refresher training, because for 2 years or so, they've been guarding air bases. They haven't been doing your traditional infantry tactics. They're really rusty. And so he makes the argument, my guys need refresher training. They haven't been shooting and moving. They haven't been doing any infantry job for 2 years. They've been basically glorified MPs, military police, for 2 years. We need some more training before we go into combat. That request is denied. They're sent into combat. They don't perform particularly well in combat. But to their credit, their commander, the colonel, had said, look, my guys need this training. And so they're just thrown right in. Again, they don't perform well. Ned Almond absolutely savages them in an after-action report after the battle that they're involved in. He says they're the worst unit in his division, et cetera, savages them. The colonel actually will go ahead and request to be relieved. In essence, he has almost a nervous breakdown, the colonel who's commanding the regiment, largely brought on by, again, the behavior of Almond and others. And ultimately, the regiment is broken up and turned into labor units. Basically, they're engineer units on paper, but in actuality, all they are is labor units. So again, that's what befalls that kind of unit. The other unit I'll mention here is the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, known as the Triple Nickels. This was an experiment started as a company and eventually never quite reaches full battalion strength, though on paper they're a battalion. Again, all African-American, parachute qualified. There is talk, I'll pull up a picture of some of them doing one of their training jumps. There's briefly talk about sending them to Europe as a result of the troop losses that are taken in the 101st Airborne Division during the Battle of the Bulge. But that never comes through. That never actually happens. And so what they wind up doing is being sent out to the Pacific Northwest, and they become smoke jumpers. And this is a job that is still done today. These are firefighters who are parachuted in to remote areas to help fight forest fires. And that's what they spend basically the spring of 1945 doing, is they serve as smoke jumpers. And actually some of the techniques they pioneered are still in use today by the National Park Service smoke jumpers. So they're very innovative and all that, but again, it's not combat. It's not what these guys wanted. It's not what these guys signed up for, but they do make their mark. And eventually after the war, the battalion will be reflagged and it will join the 82nd Airborne Division as one of the division's integral units. So anyway, perhaps the most fascinating thing to happen is regarding infantry and African Americans during the war is something called the volunteer infantry replacements. Now, volunteer infantry replacements, what's that about? Oh, sorry for that bleeding over there a little. My apologies. Basically, there was desperate need for more infantrymen, again, as a result of the Battle of the Bulge. There weren't enough replacements getting to Europe, and the Army desperately needed more riflemen. So at the behest of a general called J.C.H. Lee, who was the senior supply officer in Europe. J.C.H. Lee proposes to General Eisenhower, why don't we open this up to anybody who wants to volunteer, regardless of race? That's what he argues. And Lee and Eisenhower, both being Kansans, don't really have strong racial opinions. And so Eisenhower says, okay, it works with me. Let's go. The call goes out on the day after Christmas, 1944, for volunteers, again, regardless of race. Over 4,500 African Americans will volunteer. Only a little more than 2,200 will be accepted for various reasons: health, age. You have an MOS, military occupational specialty that we desperately need. We can't spare you, etc. Now, one of the most interesting things is these guys are forced to give up their existing ranks, and the most they can be after we've had some infantry training is a private first class. So you have guys who are giving up master sergeant rank, first sergeant rank. They're giving that up just so they can have a chance to go into combat, which to me is just, it shows what these men want to do and what they're willing to do. They're willing to give up senior NCO ranks and become privates or PFCs just for the opportunity to go ahead and fight. They're grouped together. They basically have their rifle platoons, reinforced rifle platoons, so a little bit bigger. And after they've done their training, they're assigned white NCOs, white platoon leaders. In practice, there will usually never be enough white platoon leaders and white NCOs, but there is no authorization to go ahead and promote any of them to NCO ranks. So what winds up happening is you have a lot of cases in these units, these platoons, where an African-American PFC is acting like a squad leader or a platoon sergeant, even in some cases, just because there aren't enough white NCOs and we can't promote these guys. So Sergeant, Jackson, Sergeant Johnson, Sergeant Smith, whatever, you were a sergeant before, now you're only a private first class. Well, I'm going to have to use you as a sergeant, even though I can't put stripes on your sleeves. So again, showing how much these guys want to serve, showing how much these guys want to do. Ultimately, they'll form 49 platoons. And as you can see, they're divided between 2 armor and 8 infantry divisions. And you can see which ones they are. Ultimately, 2 members of these 49 platoons will receive the Medal of Honor for their actions while serving in these platoons. The feedback from the white officers and in the divisions in which these guys serve is overwhelmingly positive. And the Army does a huge survey where they talk to not only the white officers, but the white enlisted men in these divisions, in these, what is it, about 10 divisions here. And the reaction is overwhelmingly positive. So again, these men showed what they were capable of and did it quite well. So we talked about the infantry. Let's talk about the Marine Corps. Now, I know you might be saying, well, a different branch of service. Well, but I've kind of put it in the context of infantrymen, that's kind of what the Marine Corps is known for. Not quite works out that way in World War II for these African Americans, but it's still an interesting story. So the Marine Corps never, ever had African American members until 1942, when President Roosevelt gives the Commandant of the Marine Corps a direct order: you will enlist African Americans. 2 of the first African American Marines to join are these 2 gentlemen. And the gentleman on the left is Gilbert Johnson, and the man to the right is, Edgar Huff. They are, interestingly enough, brother-in-laws. They are married to 2 sisters. Now, Gilbert Johnson, if you notice on the lower part of his sleeve there, has those hash marks. And those hash marks indicate that he has prior service. Well, he couldn't have been in the Marine Corps where he had prior service. Gilbert Johnson had done 1 enlistment in the U.S. Army as an infantry soldier, and then 2 enlistments in the U.S. Navy as a messman or mess steward, however you want to phrase that. So he had over 12 years of military service by the time he enlists in the Marine Corps. As a result of that, he gets the nickname Hashmark, because those are hash marks on his sleeve. So Gilbert Hashmark Johnson is how he will often be referred to. Infantryman for 4 years, the Marine Corps decides he'd be perfect to be a drill sergeant. And in fact, he is the first African-American drill sergeant in U.S. Marine Corps history. He will serve until the 1950s. He will finally retire in the 1950s after 30 total years of combined total 30 years of service between the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. His brother-in-law, Edgar Huff, will remain in the Marine Corps until 1972 and will retire as a sergeant major. The first well, technically, his brother-in-law was the first African-American sergeant major, Gilbert Johnson was, but I guess he would be the second African-American sergeant major in Marine Corps history. Now, Marine Corps is they've never had African-Americans, and the Marine Corps is still a relatively small service. I mean, everyone forgets that the U.S. Army in World War II ultimately will have 91 divisions. The Marine Corps never gets above 6 divisions. So relatively speaking, the Marine Corps is still a very small service. And the Marines want to keep everything segregated. So what do we do with these African Americans? Well, there's this push to get them into combat. So the Marine Corps will ultimately form 2 defense battalions, the 51st and 52nd, with African American enlistment. By the way, there are no African American officers in the Marine Corps until after World War II. So that there will never be any African American officers in the Marine Corps during the war itself. That doesn't happen. So they form these 2 defense battalions. And what are defense battalions? Defense battalions are an organization that was created in the 1930s with the idea that we could defend all these outposts, islands in the Pacific. The problem is, by the time of World War II, we're not defending, we're attacking. So these defense battalions are put out on islands we've already captured, much like the 93rd Division, and they really don't do much. I mean, once in a while, a Japanese plane will fly by and they'll try and shoot it down, but not for these guys. And technically, these are the only African-American combat units to be formed in World War II. But strangely enough, tons of African-Americans serve in combat, but not in these combat units. So how do they serve, you might ask? Well, the Marine Corps will ultimately organize 51 Marine depot companies, starting in March 1943, and 11 ammunition companies. And these are basically supply/transportation units to move ammunition and supplies on these small islands, from point A to point B. Now, these are still support units, but the reality is that because we're fighting on such small islands, in most cases, the Marine Corps is, that these African Americans will actually see quite a bit of combat because the beach is sometimes 200 yards or less from the front line. And so very often African American Marines will get into combat just because they're having to defend themselves or defend the supply depot or etc. And quite a few of these Marines will receive decorations for valor, Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, as well as the Purple Heart for wounds and unfortunately death received in battle. So the irony is the 2 combat arms units see almost no combat, whereas these 2 types of support units see extensive combat in World War II, again, because the battlefield is just so small. All right, so let's move to field artillery. Ultimately, 28 battalions of field artillery will be organized, African-American battalions. And interestingly enough, 2 of them, 197th and the 600th, will be completely African-American units, from the lieutenant colonel commanding all the way down. Both of those units will serve, by the way, in the 92nd Infantry Division, so they will see extensive combat in Europe. Generally speaking, these units are very highly rated. They're all the kind of negatives that go with the infantry units are not talked about, not discussed, not mentioned with these field artillery units. They get high marks, and there's generally no criticism, interestingly enough. So it's ironic that you would think this is a more skilled profession, more skilled trade, however you want to say it. But there's no complaints about that, and they perform very well. Another branch of the Army in World War II, which sort of exists today, but under a different name, is the coast artillery, which eventually becomes basically the anti-aircraft artillery. Now, coast artillery was designed originally to be manning huge, almost naval guns in concrete, excuse me, in concrete bunkers along the American coast to defend our harbors from invasion. That was the original intent of the coast artillery. By World War II, however, it's pretty clear no one's going to do that. No one's going to sail up a battleship to allow us to blast away at it. And so over time, the coast artillery kind of evolves into anti-aircraft artillery. Now, ultimately, battalions of African-American coast artillery / anti-aircraft artillery will be organized. What happens is this branch becomes a dumping ground. Whenever there is an argument in the African-American press or by congressmen or whatever, there aren't enough African-Americans in combat units. What they'll do is just raise another coast artillery battalion. And these units almost never get into combat. So it's a way of calming, quote unquote, the press or Congress or whomever. Yes, we have plenty of African-American combat units. Look, 81 battalions. But almost none of them leave the United States. And even the ones that leave the United States very seldom get into combat. So it's a way of hiding the issue. Now, one of these units that I do want to mention is the 320th Anti-Aircraft Barrage Balloon Battalion, very low altitude. What the heck is that? Well, barrage balloon, and if you've seen movies about, say, the Blitz of London in 1940, barrage balloons are these large balloons attached by cables that are raised over areas so that if enemy fighter planes try to do strafing runs, low-level strafing runs, they'll be caught by the steel cables that hold the balloons, and they will crash. Now, why am I mentioning this one particular one? Well, this unit started to go ashore late on June 6, 1944, on the Normandy beaches. So this unit and this supposedly, I've never been able to verify this 100%, but supposedly this picture was taken on the beach at Normandy. So these guys actually went ashore. Now, they weren't in the initial wave. They were like, I think, the third wave of the day. But they went ashore on June 6th. They started, not the whole unit, just a few of the men went ashore on June 6th, and they were there for D-Day. And they are actually credited with bringing down one German aircraft, not right on D-Day. It's like 4 or 5 days later, who tries to make a strafing run and is caught by one of their balloons and crashes. So they are a rare example of a coast artillery / anti-aircraft artillery unit that actually gets into combat and gets to Europe and gets into combat. So they're a pretty fascinating unit. The cavalry. The cavalry still existed in World War II. In particular, the unit we're talking about is the 2nd Cavalry Division. The 2nd Cavalry Division, there's its division patch. Very similar to the, for those of you who might have experience with the 1st Cavalry Division, a similar size and kind of shape. The 2nd Cavalry Division was all African-American. The historic 9th and 10th Cav, plus 2 new units were organized. These units were organized, but they never got together in one place to do any training. They were trained at various locations around the United States. They were never retrained in ground combat. The 1st Cavalry Division existed in World War II, and at a certain point, they turned in all their horses, and they were retrained as infantry, and they fought in the Pacific. These guys are still horse cavalrymen until they're notified they're going to be transported overseas. They turn in their horses, they load up, they're shipped to North Africa, expecting to go fight in Italy, where they're in desperate need of more troops in Italy. And instead, they are dismantled. The entire trained division is taken apart and turned into engineer units, transportation units, supply units, etc. This is the only case in World War II of a trained combat division having that happen to it. And it's a real shame. How about the armored force? We don't have armor as a branch. It's called the armored force in those days, and tank destroyers. There are 3 tank battalions and 11 tank destroyer battalions. Many of the tank destroyers never actually get into combat. There's a whole complicated thing there about the utility of that whole idea and stuff. We're not going to get into that. That's beyond the scope of what we're talking about. But the tankers who get into combat are very well thought of. Those 3 battalions perform exceptionally well. They're highly decorated, and they contribute very highly to the victory in Europe. Let's turn to a different branch of service completely. What about the U.S. Navy? Well, the U.S. Navy had originally been much more progressive in its attitude toward African Americans, going back to the founding of the country and the founding of the Navy. And definitely from the Civil War onward, Americans could do almost any job in the Navy. No officers, but any enlisted job could be done by an African American. The Navy really just didn't care. Now, what changes things is the attitude of Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels and President Woodrow Wilson, both of whom are Southerners, Daniels from North Carolina, Wilson from Virginia. And they fundamentally changed the policy of the U.S. Navy regarding African Americans. In 1919, they banned African Americans from enlisting in the Navy in any job, in any capacity. Both the Navy and also the Coast Guard does the exact same thing at the exact same time. And that ban remains in place for 14 years until 1933. It's only with the election of President Franklin Roosevelt that he lifts the ban, but initially he only allows African Americans to become mess stewards. It's not until 1942 that all career specialties are open to African Americans. And so the attitude for a lot of African Americans is, so am I a sailor or am I a messman? Because it seems like overwhelmingly, that's really the only job they want me to do. Even though you have guys like Dory Miller there on the right, who receives the Navy Cross for his actions at Pearl Harbor, he's still a messman. In fact, when he dies in 1943, when his ship is sunk, he is still a messman. He is not in one of the other career fields in the Navy. And likewise, am I a sailor or? Because that's the other big occupation of sailors in the U.S. Navy in this period. You can be a messman or you can be a stevedore. You can be in some kind of career where you're just basically moving stuff around. You're not really contributing in a major way. That will finally change with the commissioning of the USS Mason. The USS Mason is a destroyer escort, and she is commissioned with an entirely African-American crew. All the officers initially are white, though some black officers will join later on. But the Mason is basically an experiment to see if African-Americans can perform all these duties that are requested of them. And of course they do. They perform exceptionally well. The Mason has a great service history, and it does a lot to dispel the myths of African-American incompetence that existed within the Navy. The Navy will later then, as a second experiment, commission a subchaser, the PC 1264, again with an all African-American crew and white officers. The Navy will be very late to the idea of commissioning African-American officers. And the first group, who were known as the Golden 13, and this is 12 of them, I'm not sure why the other gentleman wasn't available for the picture. These are the first officers, black officers in the U.S. Navy in Navy history. They're the first time that has ever happened was in 1944. All but one of these men will leave the Navy after the war. One of them, Dennis Nelson, will stay until the 1960s. He'll still be an officer in the 1960s. But again, it's a very late to the game kind of thing, and there's not that much that happens for these guys. They're mostly in supply positions, things like that. They're still very much constricted. Or construction battalions. There are actually 2 African-American construction battalions organized in World War II. The CBs, as you know, have a reputation for they're trained also as infantrymen, so they can, we build, we fight is one of their mottos, and 2 of them are organized. They perform fairly well. They're never sent into truly combat situations. The only problem they have is that initially the Navy takes a similar attitude to the Army and says only Southerners can command these units. After some issues happen, the Secretary of the Navy gets involved, and several of these Southern officers are replaced with Northern officers. And after that, those battalions never have any problems, interestingly enough. What about the Coast Guard? People often forget about the Coast Guard. Coast Guard during times of war usually becomes subordinate to the Navy, or at least the Department of the Navy, during combat times. The Coast Guard had likewise never had African Americans, much like the, no, I shouldn't say never. They had never formally enlisted them. There had been some African Americans in one of the services that were merged into the Coast Guard, but the Coast Guard itself never actively enlisted African Americans. And so initially, they were doing tasks like they were performing beach security. Now that might seem like, oh, that's a waste of time. Well, remember, there were Nazi agents smuggled ashore on American beaches in several instances in World War II. And the fear was that that was going on all the time. And so initially, African Americans are doing these jobs, these shore jobs. Well, because the Coast Guard is so small, what this meant is that because African Americans were doing these shore jobs, it meant that guys at sea couldn't rotate to shore jobs. There were no open jobs for white Coast Guardsmen to rotate to. And so what happens is this is building up and it's becoming a tension point. And the commandant of the Coast Guard is approached by an officer, and he basically proposes, let's try to integrate. You know, this is different from what the Navy does. The Navy does all black crew. This officer in the Coast Guard says, let's go ahead. Blackford is his name, Lieutenant Commander Blackford. He says, let's integrate a crew. And so they take this ship, the USS Sea Cloud, and they have a fully integrated crew. African Americans represented about 20–25% of the crew. And they do a cruise for about 3 or 4 months, no problems. And so they'll do it again with another ship, different ship, no problems. And so effectively by about late 44, early 45, the Coast Guard just says, okay, that's it, we're integrating. So the Coast Guard is technically the first service, even though they're technically not a military service, they're the first service to completely integrate and just say, we've tried this twice, it worked perfectly. We're not going to care what anybody can do anything they want. Oh, and by the way, if you're interested, the USS Sea Cloud was a former yacht, and it is now owned by, I believe, the Holland America line. And so if you'd like to take a very expensive cruise on the USS Sea Cloud, you still can. That's what she looks like today. So to wrap things up, the service I haven't talked about is the one that maybe people were most familiar with African-American participation in, and that is the U.S. Army Air Force. The famous Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group, and those are the squadrons that were part of it. They are arguably the most successful African-American combat units in the war, period, bar none. Their participation in combat is well known, well documented. And I would argue part of the reason, or not part of, a good chunk of the reason they are so successful is their commander. Colonel, later Lieutenant General, Benjamin O. Davis Jr. I'm sorry, I put senior there. That's my mistake. This is Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the son of Brigadier General Davis. Was the first African-American to graduate from West Point in the 20th century. He was with the class of 1936, which also included men like William Westmoreland and Creighton Abrams. he is largely responsible for the success of the Tuskegee Airmen, being there and making sure things went well. Now, unfortunately, as successful as the fighter squadrons are, the Army Air Force decides to also organize a bombardment group and bombardment squadrons. And because these men are commanded by white senior officers, they do not have as smooth of a transition, as it were. They're trained to fly twin-engine bombers, and they're being trained mostly, interestingly enough, mostly in the north, in places like Michigan and Indiana. And what happens is these bases, unfortunately, are still operating in a segregated fashion, despite the fact they're located in northern states that don't have segregation or don't have at least legal segregation. And so what happens is the officers of the squadrons try to integrate the officers' clubs where they're stationed. They are met with resistance, and ultimately a large portion, approaching half of the officers in the squadron, are threatened with court-martial for disobeying a direct order by trying to integrate the officers' clubs. Ultimately, only 3 men will actually be court-martialed. 2 will be found not guilty. 1 will be found guilty only because, as he tried to enter the club, he shoved a superior officer. But this, it's known as the Freedman Field Mutiny, is unfortunately one of the darkest moments for an otherwise successful Army Air Force participation in World War II. And again, it will have an effect on the Air Force, as the Air Force, after the Coast Guard, will be the first independent service, once she gains independence in 1947, to completely integrate her service. So that's kind of an overview of, again, of these African-American combat units in World War II, and what they were involved with, what they did, etc. Obviously, my book has far greater detail, and I talk more about before World War II. I talk a little bit about after World War II, but that's where I'll end my presentation, and hopefully people will have a few questions, and I'll try and answer them to the best of my ability.
Oh, we definitely have some questions, Dr. Bielakowski. Probably more than we can get to, but I am going to go ahead and bring some of those up right now. Bear with me just a moment. Never do this in the right order. Question number 1. Where did African-American units, I can't see my question, the enlisted troops, where did they train at during World War II?
So the training is all segregated for enlisted personnel. And they generally tried to keep those training bases in the South, once again, because of the reasons we talked about. And if not the South, in the West. So it's either the South or the West that has most of these training opportunities. The South for obvious reasons, the West because in those days, the West is far less populated. We're used to thinking, of course, of California and other places like that as being incredibly populous places. But in the 1940s, these were pretty empty. Arizona, New Mexico, California, etc. So that's where generally they were trained. Now, the interesting thing is for the officers, the Army already had figured out that it's financially doesn't make sense to set up separate training just for African-American officers. So if you were an African-American infantry officer, you trained at Fort Benning in a class with white officers. So the Army was willing to integrate when it saved them a buck. But when they saw it wasn't going to save them any money, that was the difference.
Well, and I noticed as well, you spoke about some of the officers actually being West Point graduates. And it kind of struck me as curious. You're going to have these leaders train at these highly professional institutions, but then you're not going to put them in the roles that they trained to be in.
Right. Yeah. Ben Davis is the only, until I think 1944, he is the only West Point only African-American West Point graduate in the 20th century. So he's class 36, he's there. And if I remember correctly, there's another African-American officer that graduates in the class of 44, but he doesn't get involved till later. All the other officers in the Army, because that's primarily what we're talking about officers, as I mentioned, you don't see very many in the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Marine Corps, none, are pre-war ROTC graduates or guys who got direct commission, not direct commissions, but go through OCS, that kind of format. And again, OCS, if you're going for OCS, you're going to wherever your branch's OCS does it. If it's infantry, it's Fort Benning. If it's cavalry, it's Fort Riley, etc.
Bring up our next question here. Did you find in your research that other minority service members were treated as the same as African Americans?
Largely, no. Now, let me caveat that. For Latino Americans, there was always a certain level of prejudice, but there was no institutional prejudice, as it were, for Latinos. So a Latino could join any, as long as they were not Afro-Latino, okay? They could join any unit, serve in any capacity, etc. Now, might they find prejudice on the individual basis from the men in their unit? Absolutely, they might. But there was no institutional prejudice. Now, having said that, the one exception to that rule is Japanese Americans. And most people will know already the story about the Nisei and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which are completely segregated, just as African Americans were. And that, again, that's a weird situation because prior to World War II, there had never been segregation for Japanese Americans. And so there are, both in the National Guard and in the active duty Army. So it's very much because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, because of Japanese being an enemy, that segregation is implemented. It didn't exist before December 7th, and it won't exist after the end of the war either. But for those war years, yes, Japanese Americans are treated roughly as badly.
Were African-American soldiers given the same pay rate as white soldiers were? Or were they forced to take a pay cut as well?
No, they were given the same pay. And I probably where that question comes from is the movie Glory, which, and if you haven't seen the movie Glory, I'm surprised by the number of younger people who've never seen the movie Glory. It's about the 54th Massachusetts, one of the first African-American units in the Civil War. And they were initially given lower pay for the same work, as it were. But that was sorted out during the Civil War. And after that point, from 1863, I think, onward, there is never a distinction in pay. The pay is always exactly the same.
So if you're an E3, you're going to get paid the same no matter what your background is.
Exactly. Oh, and by the way, just a bit of trivia, the E numbers were reversed in World War II. So an E1 was a master sergeant, and it worked all the way downward. So just to mess with you.
So if you're in E8, you're at the bottom of the
exactly. You're a private, no class.
Were African Americans treated differently by the enemy, especially considering the status of POWs, or even as seen as liberators, maybe by the French?
In the Pacific, I have not encountered any instances of African Americans being captured, because there would have been none in the Philippine division that fought in the Philippines in 1941-42. So I've never encountered anything in the Pacific. And like I say, the amount of combat they got into during the war, regardless of which branch of the service they were in, was pretty minimal in the Pacific. So in the Pacific, I can't offer a comment. To my knowledge, it never happened. Now, in Europe, I can say that by and large, they were not as well treated as white POWs by the Germans, but it wasn't to the degree of treating them as, say, Jewish people were. It wasn't that extreme. And it also had to do with who was with them when they were captured. So if there were white soldiers with them who were willing to kind of say, no, that he's with us, they were generally left alone. Whereas if the white soldiers also kind of rejected them, well, the Germans would kind of get on the bandwagon, as it were. The exception is the officers. So there were a few of the Tuskegee Airmen pilots who were shot down and were captured. And to my knowledge, they, because they were officers, were not treated any different from any other Allied officers. And again, I don't know why that happened, but it just seems like the Germans officers are in a totally different class than enlisted men. And you're an officer, you're an officer. It doesn't matter the color of your skin.
That is interesting.
And as far as being liberators, by and large, the French populace didn't care. And in both World War I and in World War II, their attitude is an American's an American. And they really made no distinctions based on color of skin. The French really tended to have an attitude of, and the British too. So during the period when we are still in Britain, preparing for the D-Day invasion, the British were utterly indifferent to race. And unfortunately, what happened is that caused a lot of problems among white Americans. So you would have dances, for instance, and if there was a dance and there were African-American soldiers and white American soldiers, that would almost always result in a fight. That would almost always result in some sort of fight, because from the white Americans' point of view, the idea of black soldiers dancing with white women was utterly unacceptable. Whereas among the British themselves, they were kind of utterly indifferent. And I'm trying to remember, it was a fairly famous writer, British writer of the period, actually made the kind of offhanded comment that the only Yanks with good manners were the black ones, or something like that. He makes some kind of comment that again, a lot of Brits did not like white Americans. They were kind of seen as being boorish, throwing their money around, etc. But generally speaking, they had almost a higher opinion of African-American soldiers and sailors than they did of white American soldiers and sailors.
Wow. Just the opposite you would think would be true, but
absolutely.
What was the most surprising thing that you came across during your research?
Well, the most surprising thing, quite frankly, has to do with the Tuskegee Airmen. There is a myth that the Tuskegee Airmen, once they started supporting American bombing raids on Germany, that they never lost a bomber. And this myth has been so often repeated in so many scholarly works that I had taken it for granted. And during my research, I encountered the fact that this is not true. A colleague of mine who worked for the Air Force, just retired about 2 years ago, Dr. Daniel Hallman, who worked for the Air Force Research Agency, I think it was called. He, along with the Tuskegee Airmen Foundation, wound up doing some research and discovering that, in fact, no, the Tuskegee Airmen had lost several bombers, just as you'd expect. These bombing raids were brutal. Having a fighter with you does not prevent you from being shot down by flak. I mean, a fighter can't help you against flak. It could help you against German fighters, but it's not going to help you against flak. And so yeah, that was really amazing. That for about 50 years, maybe even 60 years, it was widely accepted by legitimate scholars, serious scholars, that no, they never lost a bomber. And in fact, that was not true. It wasn't even close to being true. Did they have really good success rate? Absolutely, the Tuskegee Airmen did. But again, they lost bombers, and just like any white unit. And initially, the reaction from the Tuskegee Airmen Institute, their organization, was very negative. That this was somehow an effort on the part of Dr. Hallman and other researchers to besmirch the Tuskegee Airmen or to tear them down. And thankfully, several African-American scholars got involved, and they were able to kind of go back over Dr. Hallman's research and say, no, this is legit. We've never done a, by the book, through the daily logs, look at, I lost this many bombers, etc. No one bothered to ever count it up. They just accepted the myth. And the myth goes back to a reporter. I don't believe it's Roy Ottley, the gentleman I mentioned. I believe it was another reporter. But he had started writing that late in the war in 1945. He started writing about this Tuskegee Airmen never losing a bomber. And the myth became so persistent that General Davis, who was actually flying these missions, was the group commander, repeated the myth in his own memoir, which was published by the Smithsonian Institution Press. And so it really shows you this. A colleague of mine referred to it as footnote momentum, that once something gets in and it's said by a prominent scholar or somebody famous or something like that, everybody just goes, oh, well, Joe, he knows his stuff. If he says it, it's got to be true. So just quote him. And sometimes we don't go back and we don't do the proper research to find out that, hey, yeah, no, that's not true. For whatever reason, he said it, but it isn't true.
Footnote momentum. I like that.
Yes. That's what a colleague of mine, Dr. Christopher Gable, always used to refer to it as.
Last question for you. What effect did you talked a lot about the African-American press. What effect did they have after the war on desegregation?
Well, they had been urging, that had been something they had been fighting for throughout the war. And again, President Roosevelt never felt he had enough political stability. Maybe that's not the right word, but he never felt comfortable enough trying to push for desegregation in the military, again, because the Democratic Party was so split between a northern wing and a southern wing. There's no doubt the African-American press had a role in desegregation. That's not even debatable. That's true. How much, what degree, specifics, I don't think I could say, but I know for a fact that they're writing things, those things are getting in the newspaper. They're emphasizing these really horrific acts that are happening. And President Truman later on, who obviously makes the decision to desegregate the military, President Truman is deeply affected by some of these really ugly incidents. And one of the incidents that pushes him over the edge, it's not the only incident, but one of them is an incident with a African-American serviceman who, after being discharged from the Army, is taking a Greyhound bus home, and he has the temerity, from the point of view of the white driver of the bus, to ask if he can use the restroom. He is then dragged off the bus by the local police, charged with being drunk and disorderly, and so badly beaten that he is blinded. And this incident is one of, it's not, like I say, it's not the only incident, but it's one of the incidents that is widely reported, obviously, in the African-American press. It does make some of the northern white press, but I have to think those kind of incidents, and not just that one, but others similar, are what's really driving President Truman. He can see these things happening time after time. He mentions that specific incident I just referred to. He mentions it in a letter to a friend, and how this is why we've got to get rid of segregation. We've got to stop this in our whole country. And by 1948, when he signs the executive order that desegregates the armed forces, he feels he's on a more solid ground. Their war isn't happening. He can afford to lose the southern base if he needs to and still get things done. It's an election year for him, and that's the irony, though. I mean, you could say, oh, well, he's just doing it because it's an election year. Well, actually, doing that hurt him in an election year, because it meant white Southerners who are traditionally voting Democrat are less likely to vote for him. And in the 1948 election, there is a third party. The Dixiecrat Party is actually running. And so he loses an awful lot of votes by making the decision to desegregate the armed forces in that crucial election year. And I really have to think it's incidents like like that, like the one I described, that are obviously very heavily covered in the African American press, that are helping push him to make what ultimately is a moral decision that we just can't keep doing this, because it's not a political decision. Because the smart political decision in 1948 is to say nothing about desegregation and wait till 1949 after the election. So it's not political in that sense, because again, remember, African Americans. That's the thing. You could, oh, he's going to get their vote. No, they're largely barred from voting because of various poll taxes and other things that are implemented, which won't be solved until the 60s. Ultimately, one of them with a constitutional amendment. So I do think it played a role. Exactly what degree, I couldn't say, but there's no doubt it played a role.
Well, thank you very much for being on with us today. You've done an amazing amount of work in this book, just to highlight, the services of our minority veterans. We try to show that here at the museum as much as possible. So it's almost vindicating to see these types of books and works come out. And it's just fantastic work that you've done. Fantastic presentation. For everybody who's joining us today, this will be available on our YouTube channel, probably Wednesday or Thursday of this week. So if you want to come back and take a look at this, or maybe recommend this to your friends, you can certainly find that on our YouTube channel. And again, Dr. I can't even talk today. Bielakowski, thank you so much for joining us. We greatly appreciate it. And we hope everybody has a great rest of your Monday. Don't forget, we have trivia coming up next Tuesday night. So if you are interested in our trivia matches, we look forward to seeing you then. And if you haven't joined us for trivia, come and join us. You're going to learn a lot of things, just like you did here. And we have a lot of fun doing it. So we look forward to seeing you out there for that. And once again, thank you everybody for joining us today. And hope you have a great Monday.
Thank you.
Excellent. That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad it went well. I actually did an audible right at the last minute and cut out. I had some more slides on the Civil War, World War I, and post-war, and I thought that's going to be too long. And I think that would have been way too long.
Hey, when I told you that I was working for the Navy Museum Systems too. I was down in Great Lakes in Illinois, and that's where the Golden 13 are training at.
Right.
We always kind of heard this rumor, and once again, maybe it's just footnote momentum, but that they were accused of cheating on their officer entrance exams, and they made them retake the exams.
I've heard that too.
Higher the second time than they did the first time.
I've heard that too. I couldn't tell you 100% if it's true or not, but I've heard that. It's been repeated. There's 2 books on the Golden 13 that are out there. One's a little more dated, but it was done while several of them were still alive. So it was kind of a semi-oral history. And then there's a more scholarly one that just came out literally like as I was writing my book. So I was so glad it came out because I was able to crib off that a little. But I could swear, I know that I'm almost positive that story is told in the first book, the one that was more of an oral history. I can't remember if it was said in the second book. So that's something I'd have to look up to see if it was, but I've heard that story too. And that's,
do you recall the name of that second book?
I can pull up my bibliography. Hang on, let me do this. I gotta move you over here, close my presentation, and let's see here. Okay. Give me a sec here. Publishing. Okay. Bibliography. Where is my bibliography? Oh, that's the cover of the book. Don't want that. Excuse me. Yeah, the Navy, I was appalled at how little the Navy has done on African American history. You'd think they'd want to, really play that up.
The Navy's done a really terrible job at just in their history in general.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that they're trying to address right now. But, for many, many, many years, they've just done a really poor job at maintaining their institutional heritage.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I had a colleague at Leavenworth who's still there, Dr. John Kuhn, who's a retired Navy officer. And whenever I'd ask him a Navy history question, he'd go, "Yeah, don't look on the Navy website. They won't show you that. Here, I'll tell you where to find it." So I'm going to email you the title of the newer book. And again, I thought it was from a scholarly press, but when I looked at it, it's from press like I barely have ever heard of. But I thought it did a better job of, okay, here we go. I thought it did a better job of laying things out as a history rather than an oral history. Because, oral histories are always tricky because, especially in this case, because it was done, how many decades later?
Yeah.
And, what do you remember? What do you don't remember? And,
how are the questions posed?
Exactly.
What kind of topics were you talking about? And did you switch? Yeah, it can be problematic.
Yeah. So I'll send that. I'm just looking at any of the other Navy titles, if there was anything else that was the Naval Academy. Yeah, I guess it's just that one that is more recent. So there, I just sent it. But yeah, like I say, I thought that one was a little bit better. The oral history one was good. Don't get me wrong. They had some nice little nuggets in there, nice little stories and so forth. But yeah, the Navy and the Coast Guard, likewise, all that information that I was able to glean was like all over the place. The Coast Guard had done a terrible job on their history there. And that was really disappointing because they were the first integrated service.
I was amazed to hear that. I did not know that.
They should be touting that, Yeah. And they had Coast Guard, African-American Coast Guard officers a year before the Navy did. And again, there's nothing.
We're gonna do this wonderful thing, but we're not gonna talk about it.
Yeah. And again, I respect not tooting your own horn. That's kind of, that's kind of how people should be. But come on, this is PR. You gotta get with the game.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're another one. And like I say, the Marine Corps really, they were the ones who dragged their feet really more than anybody. In fact, supposedly, according to some of the sources I looked at, in the African-American community, the Marine Corps was known as the white man's service. They literally referred to it as the white man's service.
Ooh.
Because no African-Americans had ever been in it.
Well, I'm glad that's all changing or has changed.
Yeah.
And there's still work to be done.
Yeah.
We all know this.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, it's just fascinating to look at and to see, other than Roosevelt saying, okay, we're going to allow them to enlist in anything they want, they can enlist in. Other than that, there's no plan. It's just whatever happens, happens.
Well, thanks again, sir, for being on with us today.
Thank you, Eric.
If we can do anything for you in the future, please do not hesitate to ask. We have the 4th largest oral history collection in the U.S. We've got a great research library. So if there's anything we can ever do for you in the future, just send us a note. We'd be more than happy to help out in any way that we can.
Well, thank you, Eric. I really appreciate it. I hope this all worked out well. Hopefully you'll get some good views on the YouTube channel.
Oh, we absolutely will.
Okay. Well, hey, you take care of yourself, and I'll be in touch if I can come up somehow to Wisconsin.